So I did the math, and since the beginning of the course, we have studied exactly 23 different array methods. And that's really amazing. And not just because 23 is my favorite number, but because that means that you can now do everything you can imagine with arrays. Now, the problem is that choosing between 23 different methods is not always easy, and especially when you just started learning about them, right? So probably in your mind right now, there is a big confusion between all these methods and about which one to use when. So to help you out with that, I created this summary lecture with all the 23 array methods. And I believe that the best way to figure out which method to use in each situation is by starting to ask the question, what do I actually want from this method? So do I want to mutate the original array, or do I want a new array? Do I maybe want an array index, or do I want to retrieve an entire array element? Or do I want to know if an array includes a certain element? Or maybe I just want to get a new string to transform the array to a new value, or simply to loop over the array? Well, these are a lot of different scenarios, and by asking exactly these questions, we can now categorize the methods and then easily choose between them. So this is kind of a framework that I developed, and so let me go briefly through all of these different scenarios with you. So these are the methods that mutate the original array. So if we want to add an element to the original array, we can use push or unshift. So we already talked about all of these methods, so of course I will not explain them again. This is just a reference for you to keep. Now anyway, if we want to remove from the original, then we use either pop, shift, or splice. And finally, we also talked about 3 other methods that mutate the original array, which is the reverse, sort, and fill method. Okay, so keep in mind that you have to be careful because they do change the underlying array that we're working with, and that many times is not what we want. So if instead we want a new array, then we can use one of these methods. So if we want to calculate one array from the original, then we use map method. And this one we use all the time as it loops over the original array and creates a new one based on that. We can also create new arrays by filtering for a condition or by taking a slice of the original array. We can also concatenate 2 arrays and create a new array based on that. And finally, we can flatten the original array using flat and flat map. Next, sometimes we need an array index. And for that, we have the index of and find index methods. Now, the difference between them is that find index can basically search for an element in the array based on a test condition that we provide in the callback function. But besides that, they are pretty similar and both give us the index of a certain element in an array. Now, if we actually need the array element itself, then we use the find method. And so this one again is based on a test condition specified in a callback function. Next up, sometimes it's very important to know whether an array includes a certain element or not. And for that, we have includes, some, and every. So with includes, we can simply test if an array contains a single value, while on the other hand, with some and every, we can specify a condition based on a callback function. So some is going to return if at least one of the elements in the array satisfies the condition, and every only returns true if all of the elements satisfy the condition. So these 3 methods all return Boolean values, which is very helpful in a condition. For example, in an if-else statement. Okay, so that's where you many times will use one of these methods. Next up, sometimes we want to transform an array into a string, and then we use the join method. Or we might want to reduce the entire array to just one value. And as we already know, for that we use the reduce method, just as we studied in this section. So in the reduce method, we use an accumulator, which is like a snowball, to boil down an entire array to just one single value. And that value can be of any type. So it can be a number, a string, Boolean, or even an array or an object. All right. And so in fact, we could replace some of these methods that we have here with a reduce. Now, if all we want to do is to just loop over an array without producing any new value, we use the for each method. So remember, this one does not create a new array, and in fact, it doesn't create any new value. All we do in the for each method is to basically just do some work, but not produce a new value. All right, and that's it. That's an overview of all the 23 methods that we can use on arrays. And it might be a good idea to somehow keep this overview handy. For example, print it out on a paper or just store it somewhere on your computer. Anyway, now all there's left to do in this section is to complete the final coding challenge. So let's do that right in the next video. Now, before we go to that coding challenge that I just promised you, let's actually practice these array methods a little bit more. And again, that's because I had many people actually request yet another practice lecture of these array methods. And so you asked for it, and so here goes that lecture. So again, here you can already see the next coding challenge, but let's for now focus a bit more on some array exercises. And of course, we're going to continue working on our accounts examples. And the first exercise I want to do here is actually a very simple one, in which all we want to do is to calculate how much has been deposited in total in the bank. So in all the accounts across the bank. So let's call that bank deposit sum. And so, as always, let's take our accounts variable, which is that array which contains all the four bank account objects. Now, the first thing that we need to do here is to somehow get all these movements that are in these different objects all into one big array, so that we can then from there filter the deposits and then add them all together, just like we have been doing many times throughout this section. So let's use the map method here, because we basically want to create a new array out of the accounts array. But now we want to create an array which only has all the movements. And so, as you know already, whenever we want a new array with the same length as the previous one or as the original one, then we use map. And our callback function here, again, each account is called like this. And then all we want to take out is account dot movements. And let's start by immediately taking a look here at this variable. And of course, missing the log here. And indeed, we get an array of arrays. And here are all the different movements. Now, how do we get all of these values out of the arrays and into the main arrays? So whenever we have an array of arrays, how can we basically remove all the values into the parent array? Well, remember that for that, we can use the flat method. So just like this. And now indeed, we got a big array with all of the movements that we had previously. However, I hope that you remember that we can even simplify this here even further. So this map and flat, because as it turns out, it's very common that we want to do these two operations at the same time. And so that's the case here. And so instead of map, we can simply use flat map like this. So that will apply or map callback function and then flatten the result. And so you will see here that the result looks exactly the same. And now all we need to do is to filter for the deposits. So basically for the positive values. And so this is nothing new at this point, and the same for now adding them all together. So we have done that many times before. So let's just write it out here as we already know how it works. And here we go. So the result is 25,180. And let's say that they are all in the same currency. So all dollars or all euros. So this part here was the same as we had done before. The only trick was really this part here. So getting all the different movements array out of the accounts array and then putting them in one flat array so that we could then filter and add them all together. Let me just add here a number. So that was exercise number 1. And now in exercise number 2, I want to count how many deposits there have been in the bank with at least $1,000. So let's call this here num deposits 1,000. And there are actually 2 ways of doing this. So I will start with the way that is probably easier, but then after that, I will actually save the same problem using the reduce method. So many people have asked me for advanced use cases of the reduce method because it is probably the most difficult of all of them. And so therefore, I want to show you how we can basically count things using the reduce method. But again, let's start with the easier solution here. And so if we want to count the deposits, basically now we have to do the same thing as we did here, right? So we have to take all of the movements and put them all into one array. And let's log that here already. And here it's accounts. And so you see we have a similar result to previously. And now what we could do here is to filter for movements greater than 1,000, like this. So movement greater than 1,000, which leaves us only with these. And then from that, we can simply take the length, right? And so this will then return 5. And indeed, this shows us that we got 5 deposits over $1,000. Let's say at least, so greater equal. All right, so that was one way of doing it. Let's comment it out because as I mentioned before, I actually want to show you how we could do the same thing using reduce. So let's get rid of this part because the flat map, of course, we still need that. We still need that array with all the values themselves. Now, okay, so you already know that the callback function of the reduce method always has as a first parameter basically the accumulator. So that's like the snowball onto which we want to accumulate a certain value. So here that is the sum, which we started at 0, and then onto that sum we keep adding the current element, and then basically in each iteration we returned that entire new value. So the previous sum plus the current value. Okay, so again, this here is the accumulator, which is like the snowball onto which we keep adding our snow, which in this case here was the sum. But now in this case, our snowball, so our accumulator, will be the number of movements that are greater than 1,000. All right, so let's call that the count, and then here again the current. Then here we're going to have the function body, and again we will start counting at 0. So this initial value right here is just like having any value outside of a loop where we keep storing a new value. And that new value might very well be a counter that we only update on a certain condition, which is exactly what we're going to do now. So we will say that whenever the current value is greater or equal than 1000, then we want to return the count plus 1. And otherwise, we just want to return the count. So give it a save, and here we get our result. I think it was 5 previously. Let's just take a look at the array itself by simply logging it to the console here like this. Or we should probably even do this to actually see the whole array. And you see that it is indeed 6. So before it was just 5 because I had it like this. And so you see there is one movement with 1000, and so then it is only 5. But what matters here, and let's get rid of this. So what matters is that our reduce function here works. So we can even use reduce to basically simply count something in an array. So what's important to keep in mind is that we have this value here outside. So this accumulator, which we can use to reduce the array down to anything that we want. And in this case, it is a counter, but it could really be anything. And we will actually do something even more sophisticated in the next example. But for now, I want to bring your attention to this part here of the code. So this adding 1, right? So you know that there is an operator for simply adding 1. So let me duplicate this here. Then I will comment it out. And again, you know that we can simply use plus plus here like this, right? Or at least we think so, because now as I reload, we are back to this being 0. So why do you think that is? Well, there is actually something that I didn't tell you about the plus plus operator. And so I thought that this was a good opportunity to maybe clear that up. And for that, let's simply do a very simple example down here. Let's say let a equal 10. And then let's log to the console a plus plus. And so again, you see that a is actually still 10, even though we used this plus plus here. So why is that? Well, the plus plus operator does actually increment the value, but it still returns the previous value. So if we now log the a again here, you will see that now it is indeed 11, right? So the plus plus operator did its job here, but the thing is that when we use it like this, it will still return the old value, which here was 10. All right, and so the same thing happened here. So we did count plus plus, which then increased the value from 0 to 1, but the result of this expression here is still 0. And so 0 was returned here to the next iteration, and therefore, in the end, we will always have 0. So like this, it's impossible to increase the value to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So this is actually something really important to understand about the plus plus operator, and which I didn't make really clear before. Now, fortunately for us, there is an easy solution, because we can simply use the so-called prefixed plus plus operator. So we can write it before the operand, so plus plus a. And so now the result of this here should already be 11. So both of these should now be 11. And indeed, they are. And so if we do the same thing here, then that will now finally increment or counter here, and we are back to seeing 6 as our result here. So let me keep this one here actually just as a reference, again, because I didn't talk about this before. All right. So that was exercise number 2. And now let's go to exercise number 3, which will be an even more advanced case of the reduce method. And in this one, what we're going to do is to create a new object instead of just a number or just a string. Because why not? So we already know that reduce boils down an array to just one value. And so that value might very well be an object. It could even be a new array as well. And in fact, we could use reduce to replace many of the other methods that we have. So reduce really is like the Swiss knife of array methods. We could use it for everything. Okay, and with that being said, let's get started on this exercise, of which the goal is to create an object which contains the sum of the deposits and of the withdrawals. So basically we want to calculate these two sums all at the same time, all in one go, using the reduce method. So let me call this one sums, and then we have to start again in this way. So we need to get all of our movements into just one array. So I'm just copying that. And then here comes the reduce method. So here the first element, as always, is the accumulator, which again I will just call sums. And then the second one is the current value. Here we will actually need a function body to write our code. And then we need the initial value of the accumulator as always. And as I was saying, the goal of this exercise is to create an object. And so our starting point then of course also needs to be an object. And this could be an empty object just like this, or we could of course also already start filling it. So let's say that we want to start with deposits of 0 and withdrawals at 0 as well. Okay, and now here in our function body, we can simply basically ask if the current value is a deposit or a withdrawal. And once again, we do that by checking if the value is greater or below 0. So if it's greater than 0, and here again using the ternary operator, so if it is, then we want to add the current value to the deposits. So to this value here in our object, right? Now here in this callback function, what actually is this object here? Well, it is simply sums, which is our accumulator, right? Because this here is always the initial value of that accumulator, so of this variable. So we can access the deposits on sums dot deposits, and we can then add the current value onto that. And if not, so if current is below 0, then we can add it to the withdrawals. Okay, now we're actually not yet done here, because remember that in an arrow function, the value is only automatically, so implicitly returned when we don't have a function body with curly braces. But right now we do here, right? And so therefore we have to explicitly, so to manually return the accumulator from the function. So that's how the reduce method works. We always have to return the accumulator from each iteration. Now, usually that happens implicitly, like here, but you already know that this function here has an implicit return, right? But this is easy to forget in these cases, so that's why I'm emphasizing it here. So again, we always need to return in the end the accumulator. And so now this should actually already work. So sums, and indeed we get all the deposits and all the withdrawals. And this value should be the same, as this one here, right? But now we calculated it in a different way and put it directly in an object by using the reduce method like this. So that's great. And let's actually destructure this object immediately. So we can do this. So we need to now use the exact same names as here. So deposits and withdrawals. And so here we can now log these two to the console. And indeed, we now get these two values here. Now this works just fine already, but I don't really like this part here so much. So let me just show you another way in which we could do it. So I'm just commenting it out here. Maybe you actually like this part here more, but we actually have some duplication here. And so let's fix that. So this part here is very similar to this part here, right? All that changes is the deposits and the withdrawals. And so we can actually do this. So here we can now conditionally say that we want to select either deposits or withdrawals based on this condition, right? So using here the brackets notation instead of the dot notation. So in this case, we will want to get the deposits and otherwise the withdrawals. And so then it's onto this value that we want to add the current one. And here I probably have some spelling error. And yeah, so we get the same result, but I think that this way here is just a little bit cleaner. But in any way, what matters here is that we were able to create a brand new object based on the reduce method. And this can be really helpful in many situations. And so please take some time to review this exercise, because this was really a great use case on how to use something other than a primitive value as the accumulator of the reduce method. And I would even challenge you to do this with arrays. So as a challenge, I would challenge you to recreate any of the examples that we did previously in this section with map, filter, and reduce to use only the reduce method. And that is totally possible. And so, yeah, you can try that out. You don't have to, and I will certainly not do that now. But as an exercise, and to get an even better understanding of the reduce method, you could totally do that. Now, this lecture is already running a bit long, but I still have one more exercise here for you. So let's quickly do that. And this one will not have anything to do with the accounts now, but instead what I want to do now is to create a simple function to convert any string to a title case. So title case basically means that all the words in a sentence are capitalized except for some of them. So there are some exceptions. Let me try an example here. So this is a nice title would be converted to this is, and then the A is lowercase. So this is one of the exceptions. And then nice title. All right. So let's get to work here. So convert title case is going to be a function which takes a title and will then convert it. And so this is going to be a nice exercise combining string and array methods all in one function. Let me start by writing an example of a string here that we might want to capitalize. So convert title case. And let's actually try this one. And let's also try some more. This is a long title, but not too long. So just to see what happens here, and also just to put some of the different exception words in there. And is another title with an example. Like this. And so now we can worry about writing our function here. And let's start by creating an array which contains the exceptions, so the words that should not be capitalized. And the exceptions are a, n, the, but, or, on, in, and with. And there might be some other exceptions here, but this is just an example. You can always search for title case on Google and see the exact rules if you want to make sure that this really works. All right. And by the way, it is a bit of a common pattern to create an array of exceptions and then use that for some computation further down the road. I've done this myself many times, and so keep this technique in mind. But now let's go on to the actual conversion. So let's call it title case. And so, of course, we must work on this title argument that comes in. And so what should we start by doing? Well, first of all, let's do something that we should many times do with our input strings, as I mentioned before, which is to convert them all to lowercase. And this is especially important in this case because we are now working with capitalization. So we will capitalize some of the words, and so they should, of course, all be lowercase to start with. So that's then going to affect like this or this word here. Then we need to capitalize each word here individually, of course. And so we need to be able to work individually on each of the words. And so whenever that is the case, we need an array, right? So we need to split this string into an array so that these words, which are separated by spaces, each of them are going to be one of the elements of the array. So split, and then by the empty string, and then by the space character. And this is, of course, far from being done, but let's nonetheless already return this just to see if it works. Okay, so this is exactly what we just did. And so now let's work on these words. So basically we want to now go through the array and capitalize each of the words that is not in the exceptions array, right? So here, for example, the A is in the exceptions array, so we don't want to capitalize this word, but we want to do it for all the other ones. So basically we want a new array with all of these same words here, so the same 5 elements, but some of them capitalized. And so again, whenever we want a new array of the same size as before, we use map. And so now finally our old friend map comes into play again. So in this array, each element is a word, so let's call it that. And so again, we want to capitalize it. So let's just do it for starters for all of them. And remember that one of the techniques to doing that is to take the first character of the string, so like this, and put it to uppercase, like this, and then we simply add the rest of the string to it. Remember? So we did that previously. And so the rest of the string is basically taking everything starting at position number 1. So let's check that. And indeed, it worked beautifully. Now, the only problem is that we have these exceptions here. So we have an A here and a but, and here is a with. And so we want to now use the exceptions array to exclude them. So how should we do that? So excluding kind of sounds like filtering maybe, but that's not what we want here. Because we still want to keep an array of the same length, we just don't want to apply this here to all the words. And so what we're going to do here is another logic. So we will do exceptions. And then we are going to check if the current word is included in that array. And so for that, we have another array method, which we studied many times before, which is called includes. So here we are checking for that word, and then, as you know, this will return a boolean, so true, false. And then we can use that boolean to basically ask if the word is an exception or not. So if the word is indeed included in the exceptions, then we want to simply return that word, right? And only otherwise we want to then return the capitalized version. So let's check. And indeed, that already worked. So a and but and down here the with are now no longer capitalized. Let's actually change or fix that here. Exceptions like this. So that looks better. So again, let's go over that logic here. So if the current word, so for example, this a here, is included in this exceptions array, then simply return that word. So without any modifications. But if not, well, then capitalize it according to this rule or this technique here that I demonstrated earlier. And so after that, it is actually really easy. Now all we have to do is to join the array back with the space, and there we go. That's actually it. I noticed that I just forgot one word here, which is and. So that's also an exception. Let's give it a save. And so this creates this weird situation where the first word of the title is actually not capitalized. And of course, we don't want that. But that's actually an easy fix. All we have to do is, in the end, then capitalize that entire title case, right? So basically doing this here on the final output that we have here. But let's not copy this. Let's instead refactor this into a standalone function. Let's put it in here actually, because we don't need this function anywhere else. So capitalize, it takes a string, and then here instead of word, we will use string to make it a general function. And then here we will call it with word. Right, so everything works the same. And then, as I mentioned earlier, when we return the title case, we simply capitalize it again. So just to make sure that a situation like this here does not happen. So title case, and here we go. Problem solved. Nice. So I hope that these were 4 nice examples for you to practice these array methods even more, so that you are now ready finally for the final coding challenge of this section. So let's go there right now. Welcome to the final coding challenge of this section. And this one can really be seen as a final test of this section. So we're going to practice most of what we've been doing here. And so let's get started. And in this challenge, we are back to Julia and Kate studying dogs. And this time they are studying whether dogs are eating too much or too little. All right. So eating too much means that the dog's current food portion is larger than the recommended portion, and eating too little is the opposite. And then there's also eating an okay amount. And so that's when the dog's current food portion is within a range 10% above and 10% below the recommended portion. And we will check that out in detail in a second. Okay, and so here are your tasks. And actually, each of them can be seen as a separate challenge. So there are 8 of them. So this is going to be a long one. And some of them are actually a little bit tricky, so a bit hard to solve. And that is, one more time, on purpose so that you can actually challenge yourself and try to do a little bit more than just what we learned here in these videos. And as always, if you cannot solve one of them on your own, then just go ahead and watch the solution and then go back to the next point. All right, now anyway, let's get started here. And the first task is to loop over the array that contains the dog objects. So that is this object here, and this is the data that we're going to work with. So it's this array called dogs, and in each position of the array, we have one object per dog. All right? So your task is to loop over that array, and then for each dog to calculate the recommended food portion, and then to add it to the object as a new property. So do not create a new array here. Just loop over the array that we already have and add the recommended food portion as a property. And so I hope you know which array method you need to use for that. And to calculate that recommended food portion, simply take the weight of the dog and elevate it to 0.75 times 28. Then, next up, find Sarah's dog and log to the console whether it is eating too much or too little. Now in this one, it's important to keep in mind, or important to notice, that these owners are actually inside an array. And so this makes this task a little bit more tricky. And so again, that is on purpose. Next up, create an array containing all the owners of dogs who eat too much. So call this one owners eat too much, and then an array with the opposite. So with owners of dogs who eat too little. Then log a string to the console for each of the arrays that we created previously, like this. So Matilda, Alice, and Bob's dogs eat too much. So that's based on this array, and then based on this array, a string like this. Okay? Then afterwards, log to the console whether there is any dog eating an okay amount of food. All right? And so let's take a look at what an okay amount of food actually means. So here we have this hint too. And so being within a range 10% above and 10% below means that the current food portion, which is stored here in this property, should be greater than the recommended food portion that you calculated before times 0.9. So that's 90%. And at the same time, it should be less than 110% basically of the recommended amount. So these two conditions here at the same time mean that the dog is eating an okay amount of food. So basically, it's what we see here. So the current portion should be between 90 and 110% of the recommended. Then number 7, create an array containing all the dogs that are eating an okay amount of food. And I want you to reuse the condition that we created before here in number 6. Finally, create a shallow copy of the dogs array and then sort it by the recommended food portion in an ascending order. Now just keep in mind that the portions are inside the array's objects. Okay? So to sort this array is a little bit trickier than what we did before, because the value is now here inside of an object and not just in the array itself. But the way that we write the callback function is pretty similar. So we will still have the A and B parameters, but these are now objects. And so to compare the recommended food portion, you will have to get that property out of each of these objects. So that's it. It's probably going to take you some time, but what matters most is that you practice and that you don't give up. But anyway, let's take now like half an hour or even 1 hour to solve this one, and then I see you back here. All right, so let's get started with the solution. So the first one is to calculate the recommended food for each of the dog. Now, as I said, you should not create a new array, but simply loop over the already existing array, so this dogs array. Actually copy it here. So copy. All right. So looping over this array, and then to each object, we want to add a new property. And so the for each method is the way to go here. Then each element is a dog. And what we want to do is to add a property. So dog dot recommended food is equal to dog dot weight elevated 0.75 times 28. And now let's take a look at the dogs. And indeed, now they have the recommended food. Now let's just get rid of this decimal part here. So let's say here math.trunc. So we used this one before. We simply truncate. So we cut the decimal parts. And so that's number one. And now number two, let's check it out again. So we need to find Sarah's dog and then log to the console whether it's eating too much or too little. So basically we need to find the object here. So in this case, that's going to be this one. So we need to find this object and then compare the recommended food we just calculated with the current food. Okay, so the trickiest part here is going to be to find the owner. But I believe we can do it. So let's call this one dog Sarah. Then it's dogs. And we use the find method because we want to find one element of the array based on a condition. So in each iteration, we have one dog. And now we want to take dog.owners. And now this itself is also an array. So it is this here. And what we want now is for this array to include Sarah. And so we can do this. Includes Sarah. And that's it. This is how we get our true or false value. So remember that in the callback of the find method, we need to return a true or a false value. And then the find method will return the first element for which the condition is true. And in this case, we get the true or false value by calling the includes method on the owners array. And so when the array of owners includes Sarah, then that condition is true, and then we are going to get this object. So let's just make sure here. And let's see. And indeed, it is the correct object. We need some more space here. This we don't need anymore. And now we just need to log to the console whether the dog is eating too much or not. And we already know that it's eating too much because the current food is 275 and the recommended is 191. So let's log. Sarah's dog is eating. And here I'm going to use my old friend, the ternary operator. Sarah.current food. If it's greater than dog Sarah, the recommended food, well then here we want to have much. Because in this situation, the dog is clearly eating too much. Oh, and of course this needs to be here inside the curly braces. And here, now it's correct. So we're asking basically this question. So if the current food is more than the recommended, then the dog is eating too much, and else too little. And so indeed, Sarah's dog is eating too much. So that's the conclusion we had already reached by looking here at the numbers. Okay, moving on. Let's take a second here to look at the exercise again. So create an array containing all owners of dogs who eat too much. So let's copy this name and then also one where they eat too little. Okay, So how are we going to do that? Well, we know that we want a new array based on the existing dogs array, right? And we want to create this new array based on a condition. So once again, we want to compare the current food to the recommended food. All right, and therefore the correct method to use here is the filter. Okay, so in each iteration we get a dog, and we're going to return whether this dog's current food is greater than the dog recommended food. Because here we are looking for the dogs that eat too much. And so that means that the current food is greater than the recommended. All right. So this will give us the dogs, but let's start by taking a look at this variable for now, even though we want the owners. So this one doesn't show it to us, but yes, so this dog here is eating more than the recommended, right? Now, we now want to get the owner, or actually the owners. So again, we want to create a new array based on an existing array, and this time this new array should have the same length as before. We simply want to take something out of the original array and put it into the new array. And so that means we're going to use map. So once again, we have a dog, and we want to return the dog.owners. All right, and now we have an array of arrays where one is Matilda and the other one is Sarah and John. And so finally, the next step to transform all of this into just one array is to call flat, right? And so indeed, we end up with this array with just one level and with all the owners of all the dogs that eat too much. So great. And maybe you can see here that we can actually do even better, because whenever we have a map combined with a flat, we can instead use flat map. So let's transform this here into flat map. And then we don't even need this part. And the result is the same indeed. Okay, and based on this one, we can easily create the owners where the dogs eat too little. So all we need to do is to invert this sign. Let's get rid of this one here. And so these are the other three owners, basically. Okay, next up, our task is to create some strings. So let me just copy the strings. And so that's based on the arrays that we just created. All right, so these are the two strings. And actually they will not be the same. So this is just an example. So here we see Alice, Bob, and Michael's dogs are together, and here they are not. So the string will be different, but that doesn't matter. So what matters is that here we have dogs eat too much. And so now all we do is to take the owners that we already have, eat too much, and essentially join them together using the separator string of and, like this. And so now we get this array here, Matilda, Sarah, and John, dog. So let's just add this, eat too much. And now the other way around, eat too little, and here too little as well. Beautiful. So we're making good progress here. Let's move on to number 5. So log whether there is any dog eating exactly the amount of food that is recommended. So whenever you see the word any, you can think of the sum method. So remember that the sum method will return true if at least one of the elements in the array satisfies a certain condition. So log to the console dogs.sum. And so one more time, we are comparing the current food with the recommended food. And this time we want to know if there is at least one dog eating exactly the same amount as the recommended portion. And so we use the equal operator here. So current and recommended food. And, well, there is none. Let's take a look at our dogs here just to confirm that. So these are different, these are different, these are different, and also probably, yeah, this is also different. And therefore, if all of them are false, then the sum method also returns false. All right, number 6. Log to the console whether there is any dog eating an okay amount of food. Okay, and so now this formula here comes into play. Let's copy it just so we see it down here. And so once again, the goal is to simply return true or false whether there is at least one dog eating an okay amount of food. So we need the sum method again. And now this a little bit more complex condition. So dog dot the current food portion needs to be greater than the recommended times 0.9. So that's 90%. And then at the same time, so this, now let me just copy it here. So at the same time, the dog should also be eating less than 110% of the recommended amount. And so now we get true. So there is at least one dog, but we don't know how many. And so that's the task basically of the next point, which is to filter out all the dogs that are actually eating this okay amount of food. And for that, we should also export this condition into a separate function. So this is really just a function, right? So we can take it and store it into its own variable. And let's call it check eating okay. And then simply the function. And so here we can then use that function. And yeah, we still get the same result. And now, as I was just saying, the goal here is to create an array containing only the dogs that are eating an okay amount of food. So we want a new array based on an existing array, but only with some of the elements. And so it is time again for using the filter method. So dogs.filter. And now this is very easy because we already have this condition callback function here in this variable. And well, we only have one dog in this condition, as you see. So that's Michael's dog, where the recommended food is indeed pretty close to the current food. And so we consider that this is an okay amount of food to eat for the dog. Okay, almost ready here. So I told you this is a long one, but I hope you're having fun with this one. This kind of seems like a real-world challenge, so like a real-world task, doesn't it? So I took quite some time designing this challenge, and even that was also a lot of fun. But anyway, let's now create a copy of the dogs array and then sort it by the recommended food portion. So let me actually copy this so we don't forget what we have to do here. So we start by creating a copy. So dogs.copy, no dot, of course, just the name is dogs.copy. And so let's use dogs.slice for that. And actually we can call the sort method then immediately on that. Okay, so here we are going to need a callback function as always, which is the sorting function, and this always has a and b as the parameters. So we could call them something else, of course, here, but I like to always call them a and b. And actually, we don't even need this block here. So remember that before, when we wanted to sort an array in an ascending order, we simply would do a minus b like this. But this was when we had an array simply like this. So just with numbers. But now we have these numbers here in objects. And so a and b are now the objects. However, the values that we want to subtract are in these objects, and we can simply get them out of there. So we want to sort by the recommended foot portion, and so let's simply do this. And that's actually it. Let's call this here dogs sort, sorted, and then let's log that to the console here. Dogs sorted. Let's see. And yeah, that worked. Oh, actually, we cannot see it yet. So yeah, here is the recommended food. So we start with the lowest one, then 191, and you see that indeed it is in an ascending order, 284 and 376. Okay, so that worked, and so we finished this coding challenge. Phew, this was a lot of work, and as I just said, also a lot of fun. And I hope you felt the same, and also that you felt the same for this entire section. So this project was a great project in my opinion. It was a lot of fun to build it together with you and to put it together and design it in the first place. So I hope you're proud of what you achieved here. And one more time, I want to congratulate you for making it this far and still sticking with this quite long course. Anyway, with that, I see you in the next section where we will actually continue building on this project by adding a couple of new things to it.